January 1945. The Ardennes was a landscape of broken trees, frozen ruts, and a sky that seemed to hold its breath. Snow crusted the pocked ground where artillery had torn the forest apart. The smells that rose from field kitchens and charred timber mixed with the unmistakable scent of metal and cordite. Men moved like shadows against a map smeared with mud and blood. It was a war of attrition amplified by winter. Supply lines thinned, units staggered from exhaustion, and the casualty list had swelled to staggering numbers. Roughly 75,000 casualties in the Ardennes by that point, and nearly 19,000 dead. On maps and in staff rooms, the front was all geometry and timings. On the ground, it was cold, chaotic, and personal. Out of that cold came a crisis that had less to do with shells or tanks and more to do with words typed at a desk, broadcast over the radio, and folded into diplomatic cables. A single chain of messages and a single press conference would push the fragile Anglo-American alliance to the edge. A political intervention by Winston Churchill, stern and unvarnished, became the pivot that preserved not only the unity of command, but the honor of American soldiers who had borne so much. A single telegram nearly tore the Allies apart. Montgomery sat alone in his trailer, the lamp spool of light throwing his typewriter into sharp relief. He was, by all accounts, a man who favored order and clarity, meticulous in preparation, proud of his formations and their rehearsals, convinced of the value of precision. He favored a concentrated, methodical approach, a single decisive thrust to the north that would roll back the German bulge on geometrically neat lines. For him, war was an exercise of planning genius, and that conviction hardened into an impatience with what he portrayed as American looseness. Sloppiness he believed compromised results. Eisenhower, by contrast, had made his career managing complexity. Not for him the technical bravura of designing a single perfect blow. His skill lay in coalition, in balance. He kept the British and American commanders in a single orbit, not to be the most brilliant battlefield genius perhaps, but to be the one who could keep disparate Allied resources pointed in the same general direction. That role, coalition manager, demanded resolve, restraint, and an acceptance of political responsibility that sometimes meant swallowing individual grudges for the sake of a larger unity. Between vacuum and vitriol, the contest of styles was never a trivial matter. It touched on national pride, on divergent doctrines, and on a late-war political reality increasingly obvious to any attentive observer. Britain, exhausted in manpower and stretched thin by global commitments, was more dependent than ever on American industry and soldiers. America's numerical and logistical predominance had become a defining fact of the alliance. In that context, the anger of a British field marshal toward American methods was no mere professional disagreement. It had potential diplomatic consequences. If you're following this story and want more deep dives like this one, take a moment to subscribe for future episodes. The operational picture in December and January was brutal and urgent. The German Ardennes offensive, what would be known as the Battle of the Bulge, had punched into the Allied lines with surprise and ferocity. Weather and terrain magnified the shock, roads became funnels clogged with vehicles, and communications were a constant struggle. Eisenhower's strategy for the campaign had been a broad front advance. Multiple forces moving forward, squeezing the axis of German retreat across a wide front so the enemy could not mass to break through any single point. Montgomery favored a different view. Concentrate strength for a decisive, controlled thrust. That difference, theoretical in staff meetings, became acute in the winter when armies and corps had to be shuffled and commands temporarily reassigned to keep the fighting continuous. Communications imperatives led to an operational transfer that would have outsized political influence. For technical reasons of radio and liaison, U.S. 1st Army and 9th Army were placed under Montgomery's temporary control, partly to simplify the chain of radio links and partly because Montgomery's headquarters controlled a stretch of front contiguous with those formations. For frontline soldiers, the transfer looked like a paperwork change. For generals and politicians back in London, Washington, and Supreme Headquarters, the move opened the door to interpretation and to ambition. Montgomery used the pause that followed to reorganize and retrench. His method was methodical: inspect, reassign, rehearse. To some American commanders, it read as an unnecessary delay at a moment when urgency seemed paramount. From the perspective of officers like Patton, the British halt contrasted sharply with a more aggressive American instinct. General George S. Patton's rapid maneuver to relieve Bastogne, swift, decisive, and very public, offered a tactical counterpoint to Montgomery's caution. Patton's single-minded operational daring saved a crucial position and demonstrated the American appetite for immediate action. What Montgomery did next changed everything. Behind the curtain of operations, Montgomery's private communications were building pressure. He sent messages that, taken together, conveyed impatience and, in public outlets, an appetite to claim credit. There were private telegrams to London and other contacts, messages that criticized American handling and implied a superiority of British methods. Those wires, by their tone and content, were a fuse. They were not yet a fire, but they made dry tinder. Then came the press conference. Montgomery stepped before journalists, and in the shorthand of a general assessing a campaign, emphasized his role in stemming the German offensive, speaking of clear strategy, orderly planning, and effective command. To his critics, the press posture amplified slights that had existed in private. Montgomery portrayed his actions as central, and in doing so, denigrated the contributions of others. That public framing was the crucial misstep. Private disputes could be handled in back channels. Public disparagement of allies could not. The response from the American High Command was swift and raw. Omar Bradley, a commander not prone to theatrical outbursts, reacted with undisguised fury. To him and to many American officers, the public rebuke of U.S. forces was intolerable. It was not simply wounded pride. It was an attack on countless soldiers in foxholes and snow, on the material contribution of American industry, and on the legitimacy of the theater command. For the U.S. leadership, this was not an academic argument about doctrine. It was an affront that risked morale and political will. Bradley's anger was matched by Eisenhower's sense of duty to hold the alliance intact. When Eisenhower learned that private telegrams had undercut public remarks, the situation crossed a line. The knowledge that a senior British field marshal had privately lobbied to supplant the Supreme Allied Commander by implying American incompetence was intolerable. Eisenhower began drafting a cable to General George C. Marshall that was, in tone and implication, a resignation, a weapon of last resort. In essence, Eisenhower prepared to remove himself from the position he believed he could no longer hold with honor if his authority was undermined by a member of the coalition publicly and privately working against him. If Eisenhower sent that cable, the alliance might not survive. The prospect of Eisenhower's resignation alarmed leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. Roosevelt's absence from the immediate scene, given his health, did not reduce the political fallout in Washington. London felt the tremor keenly. Losing the Supreme Allied Commander in mid-campaign would have been disastrous practically and symbolically. Into that breach stepped Winston Churchill. Churchill's intervention was not sentimental. He was not acting out of a desire to champion one nation over another as a matter of chivalry. He was a wartime statesman who understood the arithmetic of survival. Britain needed its American partner more than it could admit publicly. British resources were strained. British political influence rested on the continued flow of American manpower, materiel, and goodwill. If British actions, however justified in professional terms, threatened the cohesion of the alliance, Churchill recognized that the strategic costs could far outweigh any short-term gain in prestige or tactical advantage. He chose decisive and candid language. Summoned into the unfolding crisis, Churchill did not attempt a delicate diplomatic dance. He dictated a blunt message. Montgomery must apologize publicly and fully. The apology could not be half-hearted or framed as a mere correction of emphasis. It had to be unequivocal enough to repair public perception and to reassure American commanders that their honor and authority were intact. The maneuver was political triage. Churchill signaled, in effect, that the defense of British national interest required protecting the alliance and the American soldiers who represented its most tangible power. In that moment, defending American soldiers' honor was also defending Britain's own survival. Montgomery, presented with the ultimatum from Churchill, had little room in which to maneuver. Pride and personal style do not disappear overnight. He had seen himself, and had been seen by others, as the man who could impose order on a chaotic sector. Being told to retract publicly meant humiliating a carefully constructed image. Yet the stakes were higher than personal embarrassment. The public apology was the medicine required to reduce the fever of diplomatic recrimination and to restore a working relationship in Supreme Headquarters. When he spoke, the words offered for him to say, they were stilted and self-effacing. He called himself a very devoted subordinate. The phrasing was constrained by necessity, an ironical reversal for a commander famed for asserting his own stature. But the apology served its purpose. It was unequivocal enough to be broadcast and accepted. Eisenhower, in response, sent a laconic reply. "Thanks, Monty. Let's get on with the war." Those few words, short, businesslike, summed Eisenhower's priority. For him, command meant keeping a coalition functional and avoiding distractions that could be exploitable by the enemy. The immediate result was the diffusing of a political powder keg. Eisenhower did not send the resignation cable. The Supreme Allied Commander remained in office. The line of operational command, while temporarily adjusted and strained, held. The practical work of moving men and material, relieving the besieged and organizing counterattacks continued. The political theater settled, at least for the moment. The episode had consequences that rippled beyond the apology. Montgomery's public position, already the product of a proud reputation, was diminished. His influence over Allied strategic direction cooled. The balance of deference shifted increasingly toward American judgment and resources. Some of this was a natural consequence of the undeniable fact of American predominance in men and material by late 1944 and early 1945. The British came to terms, more openly than before, with the reality that the war's final phases would be driven by American logistic and numerical superiority. Numbers offered a stark reminder. At one point, that controversy was framed around relative losses and effectiveness. As quoted in contemporary accounts, later consolidated figures showed a far greater number of American casualties in the Ardennes compared to British losses. Approximately 90,000 American casualties versus about 1,400 British, figures invoked in debates about initiative and sacrifice. Those numbers, cited in the heat of argument, served different rhetorical purposes for different actors. Montgomery, in public briefings, had been accused of overstating the performance of British troops while underplaying American contributions. The apology helped to correct the public narrative, if only partially. The episode revealed something larger about coalition warfare. Words can be as consequential as bullets. A commander who ignites diplomatic fury with private telegrams or public boasts can undermine the very unity that allows combined forces to function. Coalitions are fragile organisms of trust, shared purpose, and political tolerance. When an element of that organism acts in ways that erode confidence, especially in wartime, political leaders are forced to act with a clarity that sometimes overrules professional deference. Churchill's defense of American soldiers in that instance was thus both principled and practical. He defended their reputation not because he was oblivious to British pride or because he viewed American troops as somehow more deserving of protection. He defended them because the alliance's continued coherence was a matter of national survival for Britain. American soldiers were not only men in American uniforms, they were also the linchpin of the material capability that kept Britain in the war. Preserving their honor was preserving the last and best path to victory. That defense had a cost. Montgomery's prestige declined, and the narrative of British tactical superiority lost some of its sheen. Yet there were operational consequences too. After the apology, the Allies reoriented to the practicalities of finishing the campaign. Questions of command authority were settled by the immediate need to close gaps, to shore logistics, and to press the overall collapse of German resistance. Patterns that had been developing, American material preeminence and an attendant political primacy, accelerated. The war's final reckoning would be shaped as much by factories and shipping as by the individual brilliance of any commander. Leadership style stood in relief through this affair. Montgomery's approach, prideful, doctrinal, rigid, found success in preparation and control, but was vulnerable when politics required humility. Eisenhower's approach, mediating, managerial, and politically attuned, allowed him to hold a coalition in which neither military brilliance nor personal ambition could unseat the collective aim. Patton's audacity provided a vivid counterexample. Where Montgomery paused, Patton moved, and his swift operations at Bastogne were a reminder that in war decisive action often trumps slow deliberation. For Churchill, the episode illustrated a statesman's calculus. His intervention was not an expression of favoritism. It was an insistence on the integrity of a relationship essential to Britain's survival. He perceived that the tactical squabbles among generals could metastasize into strategic ruin if left unaddressed. His remedy was neither subtle nor sentimental. He ordered a public retraction and made clear that Britain would accept no diminution of Allied cohesion, even at the price of a public dressing down for one of its own heroes. The apology itself, when delivered, felt like a small hinge turning the whole machinery back onto its rails. The theatricality of a field marshal renouncing public stridency to declare subordination was not flattering for him, but it was effective. Eisenhower's restrained acceptance of the apology and immediate desire to move on, let's get on with the war, was typical of a commander who saw his role as keeping focus on the essential task. The immediate stoppage of internal conflict allowed planning and logistics, previously threatened by dissension, to continue unhindered. In the longer view, the episode shaped reputations. Montgomery's influence in the theater waned more quickly than it might otherwise have done. His ability to claim independent moral authority over the conduct of the Allied campaign was reduced. American commanders emerged with reinforced standing. Their sacrifices and operational choices received vindication in the public record. For Britain, the moment was a blunt reminder that leadership in wartime requires sometimes swallowing pride for the national good. The drama also offered a lesson about the limits and instruments of power. Military force rarely operates in a vacuum. Political leadership must sometimes pick up where military command cannot. Churchill's action was a political one that resolved a military-political crisis. His intervention showed that wartime diplomacy often involves correcting misjudgments committed in the heat of professional zeal. The defense of a partner's honor can be paradoxically the most effective safeguard of one's own national interest. This story does not reduce to easy moral judgments. Montgomery was not a villain in the simplistic sense. His tactical mind and battlefield confidence were real assets. His critics were not necessarily paragons of civic virtue. The situation was messy because the realities of coalition warfare are messy. Each actor operated within complex personal, national, and strategic incentives. What the episode underscores is the fragility of multinational coalitions under stress and the outsized impact a few words or a single telegram can have on military conduct and political unity. Words, in this case, were weapons that could wound morale, ripple through capitals, and threaten operational command. Churchill recognized that the bluntest remedy was sometimes the most necessary, an unequivocal public correction that reasserted the dignity of American forces and restored legitimacy to the command structure. By insisting on that apology, he defended those soldiers' reputations, protected the political infrastructure that supplied them, and took a pragmatic step to preserve the alliance on which Britain's survival depended. In the end, Eisenhower stayed. The armies continued to fight. The front lines were stabilized and then pressed, and the combined effort resumed its grim momentum toward victory. But the episode left a clear trace in the record. Coalition warfare is as much about management of egos and public perception as it is about logistics and maneuvers. The survival of an alliance rests as often on statements made in press rooms and telegraph offices as on the outcome of a single battle. If history offers a small sharp moral from this affair, it is that leadership sometimes requires choosing the preservation of collective honor over personal vanity. Churchill's intervention was an act of political realism that protected the very instrument, American troops, that would shorten the war. The apology was humiliating for the man who had to offer it, but it was a repair of a breach that might otherwise have had graver consequences. For those who want to explore more about the personalities and decisions that shaped the final year of the war, Eisenhower's steady hand, Patton's audacity, Churchill's statesmanship, there are whole volumes and recorded debates to dive into. If this story held your attention, check the playlist in the description for a deeper look at Eisenhower's leadership and the relief of Bastogne. Words can be as decisive as rifles. In January 1945, the defense of American soldiers against the British Field Marshal's controversial remarks was secured not in the trenches, but in a phone call and a dictated note. Churchill's choice to defend the coalition, plainly and forcefully, preserved cohesion when cohesion was the last thing standing between victory and a fractured alliance. It was less a sentimental gesture than a strategic necessity, and it mattered.